moment you will begin to hear this say, boy, is this guy crazy. Is this a cult if I ever heard of it? Yes, it is. It's a cult. I mean, it's the cult of cults.
Cult. When most people hear that word, they picture robes, a compound somewhere remote, an army of blank-eyed followers chanting their leader's name. They picture figures like Jim Jones and places like Jonestown, which became infamous in 1978, when over 900 members died after being ordered by their leader, Jim Jones, to drink cyanide-laced punch in the jungles of Guyana. Or Heaven's Gate, a group that believed Earth was about to be recycled and that their souls could ascend to a higher existence aboard a spacecraft following the Hale-Bopp comet. Back in '97, 39 people in San Diego came to a sudden, tragic end. They were believers who thought their only way out was to leave their lives behind, together. And by picturing something so extreme, so visibly, obviously wrong, we find ourselves asking the same question. How did nobody stop it? How did people let it happen? How did thousands of ordinary men and women walk through those doors and not see what was right in front of them? Yeah, that is exactly the point. From the inside, it never looks the way it does from the outside. It does not feel like a cult. It feels like the first place that has ever made sense. They tell you that you are loved, that you have been found, that the world outside is a dangerous place, and that in here, with these people, you are finally safe. And for a person who has been drowning, who has watched their own life narrow to a single desperate need, who has exhausted every official channel and been turned away, that offer is not obviously sinister. It is a lifeline. And it's just like what this viewer commented on our South Korea cult video. The great thing about being in a cult is you don't know you're in a cult. And of all the cases that fit that description, this one is perhaps the least talked about. This is the story of an organization that, at its height, ran more than 200 centers across 17 countries, that housed nearly 100,000 people over 30 years. And behind it all, one man, known as the Patriarch. Today, we are going to uncover the twisted story of Le Patriarche, France's most unsettling cult of rehabilitation. France in the early 1970s was a country still shaking from its own recent history. The upheaval of May 1968 had cracked something open, culturally, socially, generationally. A vast number of young French men and women found themselves adrift. And into that drift, heroin arrived. By the mid-1970s, France had a full-scale epidemic, and it had almost nothing with which to fight it. Public care structures for drug addicts were barely developed. There were no widespread treatment programs, no coordinated national response, no clinical pathway for the tens of thousands of young people who were now dependent. The medical establishment was divided, underfunded, uncertain, and the families were left alone with a single question a parent can face. What do I do now? There was, in the mid-1970s, no good answer to that question. The state had failed. The churches had no framework for this particular crisis. And so families did what people do when every official door has been closed. They started looking elsewhere. They started listening to anyone who claimed to have a solution. And one man in the south of France was about to offer them one. Lucien Joseph Engelmeyer was born on November 27, 1920, in Frankfurt, Germany, into a Polish Jewish family. He would spend most of his adult life in the south of France, in the flatlands around Toulouse, where he built a successful second-hand furniture business. The furniture trade taught him something that would serve him well for the rest of his life: how to look at something worn and discarded and convince someone else that it is worth more than it appears. In 1966, he divorced his first wife, with whom he had 6 children. He left them, remarried, abandoned the business and conventional life for poetry. He founded a commune for poets and artists, where he called it the Patriarch Group. The long white beard and the habit of speaking in slow, deliberate declarations rather than ordinary sentences earned him the nickname the Patriarch, the wise elder man who understood things that others had not yet grasped. He had, by this point, abandoned 2 families. He would later go on to have 3 more children with a former schoolteacher, and then marry a Spanish woman with whom he had another son. The pattern is consistent. Engelmeyer moved through relationships as he moved through identities, extracting what he needed, discarding what he didn't, always positioning himself at the center of whatever world he had most recently constructed. In 1970, he opened the doors of a modest rural property in a small village in southwestern France to a handful of desperate young addicts. In a country searching desperately for a solution, a man who already believed himself to be a patriarch had found the one role large enough to match his idea of himself. His method was radical. He called it cold turkey. From the moment you arrived at his rehabilitation commune, La Boère, you stopped taking drugs. Not gradually, not with substitutes, not with medical supervision. You stopped. That day. And then the withdrawal began. The sweating, the convulsing, the hours and days of physical agony that heroin dependence produces when it is removed without pharmaceutical assistance. The treatment consisted of nettle herbal teas, plant baths, massage, and the constant presence of fellow former addicts who had survived the same thing and come through it. The shared suffering was the bond. Doctors condemned the method almost immediately. The absence of any medical oversight, the brutality of cold turkey withdrawal, the lack of qualified staff were fundamental objections from professionals who understood what heroin withdrawal could do to a human body. None of that stopped the word from spreading, though. For many, it seemed a last refuge. And to be fair, there's a part of this story that cannot be erased, and must not be. Some people genuinely got clean. In the early years of La Boère, some truly broken young people arrived at that farm and left, months later, without the need that had been destroying them. Those people existed. Their recoveries were real. And every single one of them was the most powerful advertisement an organization like this could possibly have. On May 2nd, 1974, he formally registered the association under the name the Patriarch. Its motto, at least on paper, was simple: help to be helped. At the time, that motto was not entirely a lie. It would become one, but not yet. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Le Patriarche grew quickly. New centres opened across France first, then Spain, then Belgium, Switzerland, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, then Latin America. By the early 1990s, the organisation had more than 5,000 residents living in 210 centres across 17 countries. The former furniture salesman from Toulouse had built a multinational, and the French state looked at all of this and saw a solution. At a moment when the government had no credible answer to the heroin crisis, no clinics, no programs, nothing that worked on this scale, here was a man who appeared to be housing thousands of addicts, keeping them off the streets, offering something that at least looked like rehabilitation. And of course, the money followed. The Patriarch organization received up to 6.6 million francs per year in state subsidies. Engelmeyer, meanwhile, was expanding his profile. He published books, several of them, actually, under the imprint of his own organization, gave interviews, and cultivated powerful contacts. A copy of his 1977 book, bearing the title For the Drug Addicts, Hope, carries a long personal inscription in French to Ethel Kennedy, the widow of Robert Kennedy. He wrote a poetic message about memory, the future, and a world freed from hatred. It is a small detail, but a telling one. Engelmeyer understood that proximity to powerful, respectable names was its own form of armor, and he pursued it deliberately. From the outside, the Patriarch looked a genuine, remarkable, impossible to argue with success story. The organization had a reputation, state funding, international reach, and a leader who knew how to talk to the cameras. However, inside the centers, behind the image, a different kind of architecture had quietly been constructed. The book The Sect Mafia, written by Bruno Fouchereau, published in 1996, describes what life was like inside the Patriarch. From the moment a new resident arrived, a narrative was built around them, one that told them, little by little, that the world outside was completely rotten, and that inside the Patriarch's community, everything was magnificent. The association was presented as paradise, and simultaneously, a sophisticated process of identity loss began. Every resident was required to hand over their passport, their national ID, whatever proved, in the eyes of the French state, that they existed as a legal individual. They were taken, kept, and the desk that held them was not one you could simply walk up to and demand them back from. And it did not stop there. The social welfare benefits, those monthly payments that the French state provides to its most vulnerable citizens, were redirected away from residents and straight into the organization's accounts. Daily existence was tightly controlled. Relationships were discouraged or monitored. Residents worked long hours for no pay, under the watchful eye of the founder's inner circle. They labored on farms and chateaux that Engelmeyer's organization had acquired at low prices and was renovating using that same unpaid workforce. And those who eventually managed to leave the centers and reintegrated into ordinary working life were expected to return a portion of their salaries to the Patriarch. The organization became, in effect, a multinational enterprise disguised as charity. Engelmeyer lived increasingly lavishly whilst preaching simplicity. Criticism was framed as weakness. Escape attempts were met with pursuit. For many, the promised rebirth felt more like imprisonment. The walls of a cult do not need to be made of concrete. They can be made of dependency. By the mid-1990s, the facade began to fracture. Financial investigators who eventually followed the money found a picture far more complex than a charity that had simply outgrown its means. Funds were flowing out of French centers, declared as deficits, and reappearing in accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Andorra. The courts would later find a structured financial operation that had been running quietly and systematically for decades. And at the center of it, the single beneficiary of the unpaid labor of thousands of drug addicts who had nowhere else to go, was Lucien Engelmeyer. By 1998, his personal fortune was estimated at approximately 150 million euros. But money does not keep thousands of people inside a closed system like that. It does not make them work without wages or accept conditions that, described plainly to a stranger, would sound like captivity. For that, you need something else. You need people to want to be there. And this is what Lucien Engelmeyer was genuinely good at. By every account, including those of people who later became his harshest critics, he was a remarkable presence. Physically imposing, with a gift for making individuals feel, in the moment of his attention, as though they were the most important person he had ever encountered. Former members describe it with striking consistency. The experience of being seen by him, of being chosen. The language of family ran through everything the Patriarch built. The communal meals, the shared labor, the rituals of daily life that created a sense of belonging so total that the world outside began to feel not just distant, but genuinely foreign. Former members describe a point at which they could no longer imagine themselves existing out there. The only life that made sense was the life inside. See, this is not an accident. It is a design. Cult experts call it the BITE model: behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. It typically begins with love bombing, overwhelming new arrivals with warmth and belonging, especially when they are at their most vulnerable. Families are portrayed as toxic. Outside contact is severed until the group becomes the only world that exists. Unpaid labor fills the days. Relationships are forbidden or surveilled. Doubt is reframed as weakness. Outside information is distorted or hidden entirely. And emotion becomes the cruelest weapon of all. Guilt, fear, and dependency are installed so deeply that leaving feels like certain psychological destruction. At the Patriarch, these mechanisms were woven into the texture of daily life. And alongside the warmth, alongside the extraordinary capacity for making people feel chosen, there was the rage. Former members describe a man who could be patient and expansive one moment and screaming the next, whose displeasure fell on anyone at any time. In an environment where his approval was the only currency that mattered, and his disapproval was catastrophe. The first country to move against him was Switzerland. In 1985, the Swiss section of the Patriarch broke away, elected its own president, and appealed to the Swiss authorities for intervention. The Swiss government responded without hesitation, seizing every Patriarch center on Swiss territory and issuing a formal ban preventing Engelmeyer from entering the country. It was, in retrospect, the sharpest and earliest signal that something was seriously wrong. Former residents were beginning to speak. Concerns were reaching journalists, anti-cult organizations, and eventually politicians. But the French government continued to fund him. The concerns were documented. The Swiss expulsion was public. The medical objections were in print. And yet, year after year, the money flowed from the French state into the accounts of an organization that every serious observer of the period understood to be, at minimum, deeply problematic. The reason, according to accounts from the period, was leverage. Engelmeyer had made it understood that if the state moved against him, if the funding was cut, and the centers were forced to close, thousands of residents would be released back onto the streets overnight, with no alternative provision. And for a government with no alternative program, disorder was a political catastrophe it was not willing to risk. Engelmeyer had turned the people he claimed to be saving into a hostage arrangement. And for years, the French state paid the price of that arrangement and called it a subsidy. Although isolated complaints and rumors about mistreatment, violence, and sexual abuse had existed as far back as the late 1970s and 1980s, it was only in 1995 the first formal legal complaint was filed against the Patriarch by a former woman resident. The charge was the exploitation of a state of vulnerability. To understand how it had taken this long, how so many women had said nothing for so long, we have to understand the specific arithmetic of vulnerability that governed life inside the Patriarch. Some of these women had, before arriving, prostituted themselves to obtain drugs. Engelmeyer knew this because the organization kept records, and within the internal logic he had constructed, in which he was the savior and they were the saved, in which his authority over their recovery gave him a claim on them that no language available to them could fully name or resist. Once they were clean, it continued. He knew that the state of dependency, no longer chemical, but psychological and social and economic, would make them silent. But things were getting complicated for him. In December 1995, the French National Assembly published a parliamentary report titled "The Cults in France." It listed multiple organizations that met the state's criteria for dangerous sect behavior. The number 13 on that list was the Patriarch. Just 3 days after the report was published, police helicopters spotted 16 charred bodies on the remote plateau of the Vercors, a mountainous massif in the French Alps. The dead were members of the Order of the Solar Temple, a secretive doomsday cult that believed suicide would allow their souls to transit to the star Sirius. The bodies were arranged in a star formation in a forest clearing, 3 of them children. Among them, the wife and son of Jean Voirnet, France's 1960 Olympic skiing champion. Investigators concluded that at least 4 of the 16 had not died willingly. The rest had been drugged and shot before the site was set ablaze. It was part mass murder, part orchestrated suicide. The timing was accidental. Its effect was not. Suddenly, the question of cults in France was no longer academic. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The Patriarch found itself, for the first time, in a spotlight it could not simply step out of. In 1998, the scandal took on a new dimension. Sexual abuse complaints, especially on minors, surfaced. In February 1998, following a formal process of internal consultation, Engelmeyer was forced to resign as president. The institution he had built, the empire that bore his name across 17 countries, threw him out. But Engelmeyer had a plan. That same year, he fled to Brazil and then Belize, where he obtained Belizean nationality. This was not a coincidence. Belize, a small state on the Caribbean coast of Central America, with limited extradition infrastructure and no binding agreements with France, offered something that no European country could any longer provide: safety from the consequences of what was coming. He left and did not come back. The organization he left behind moved quickly. All references to Engelmeyer were erased. The Patriarch was rebranded as Dianova: new logo, new identity, new stated commitment to professionalism, medical oversight, and transparency. But the centers in France were closed. The reputational damage there was beyond repair. In 2001, a French examining magistrate issued an international arrest warrant against Engelmeyer. The charge? Rape and attempted rape of minors under the age of 15. A second warrant followed for the financial crimes. He is now a wanted man, but this time by authorities. The problem was Belize. In that jurisdiction, the warrants had no legal weight. French justice could not reach him. He remained in Central America, visible, alive, not hiding exactly, but simply beyond the mechanisms that would have been required to bring him home. In 2006, 13 people connected to the Patriarch's financial operation stood trial in Toulouse. Engelmeyer was not among them. The trial proceeded without him. On the 9th of January 2007, the Correctional Court in Toulouse delivered its verdict. Engelmeyer was found guilty of abuse of weakness, the exploitation of covert labor, breach of trust, embezzlement, forgery, and money laundering. He received 5 years in prison and a fine of €375,000. But what about the sexual misconduct charges, you must be wondering? Well, the charges involving the women and the children required a different court entirely: the Criminal Assize Court. A French assize court is the specialized departmental-level court responsible for trying the most serious crimes, such as murder, rape, or armed robbery. And that trial had been scheduled. A date had been set. 6 complainants had come forward, but the assize trial never happened. On August 30th, 2007, Lucien Joseph Engelmeyer died in Belize City. He was 86 years old. The cause recorded in the obituary was pneumonia, compounded by the indirect effects of Hurricane Dean, which had struck Belize earlier that month. He died a convicted criminal who had never spent a single day in prison. He died in possession of a fortune estimated, at its 1998 peak, at approximately €150 million, built from state subsidies, the unpaid labor of addicts, and the systematic theft of welfare payments intended for the most vulnerable people in French society. The people who run Dianova today are, in the main, people who had nothing to do with what happened in those centers in the 1980s. Yet the debate continues. Was there ever genuine help? Or was it always a vehicle for one man's power and profit? And had nobody stopped him, where would it have ended? I'll leave it here for today. If this video was worth your time, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.